Hi guys, and welcome back to another Apex Racing Academy setup tutorial. Alex Simpson. We are in the BMW M8 GTE. Yep, the big boy, the beast, and we're going to take a little look at the chassis today, how you can tweak the coaches setup that they supplied you. So this season, when recording this, it's Antoine that's doing those setups. Um, so yeah, so just some little tweaks that you can do in areas of the car that perhaps will get it a little bit more dialed into your liking. So I'm not necessarily going to go into super amounts of detail in terms of what each part of the car does, just how it will affect, so you can make some sort of educated changes based on how you're feeling the car is handling. Review this video and then yeah, try and dial it in to be a little bit more customized to your own personal driving style. So I'll jump straight into it, as there's quite a little bit with the GTE cars to cover. So let's just start with some of the in-car dials and tweaks that we can make. So brake pressure, I think everybody knows kind of what brake pressure is all about. Um, if, for example, you find that you're locking up the front end of the car a lot into some of these heavy braking zones, then typically it might mean that you need to dial a little bit of the bias out. So we want a lower number here, something like this. A couple of clicks might make all the difference. It's not going to be much more, because generally the car is quite balanced based on the kind of setup. But yeah, a couple of clicks here and there can do that. If it's the opposite way around, if you find that in the heavy braking zones the rear end starts to come around, it's because you're locking the rears, and in this case we want to go slightly forward. So a couple of clicks either way, just to try and get yourself a little bit of extra balance. It's not to say just 2 clicks, go as far as you kind of need to try and get that car into a more comfortable place for you. Traction control settings, again, fairly self-explanatory. We don't want to use too much traction control in the GTEs, because obviously if that's kicking in all the time, that's going to reduce our acceleration out the corner. We really want the car to be set up nice so that it can put the power down without having to limit the power. But if you find that you just need an extra little bit of support, some of the corners, it just starts to over rotate coming out of the bends. But the set itself generally feels quite nice in other areas. There may be one click of extra traction control might give you the little bit of support that you need. Uh, of course, if the car feels absolutely planted, is not going anywhere, then come down on that traction control, because it might be limiting you slightly out of the corners. So your track control slip settings is similar to traction control. It's more of like a stability control. I think that's kind of the way I would describe it. And just the same as with the traction control, a slightly lower setting will allow you to put the power down a little bit better. A slightly higher setting will give you a little bit more support. So I would say your traction control really is a big thing coming out of slow speed corners. That's where that's going to make most of your impact. So slow speed, go to traction control. Medium speed corners and high speed corners, and you notice the car just sort of over rotating and perhaps having a bit of wheel spin on the inside tyre or something like that. That would be where you'd look at the sort of slip settings there. That will make a big difference. And your throttle shape settings here. Um, so So just to double check, as I was reading it as well. So 12, which Antoine has got, is the linear setting. So think of a like a graph. So you've got your y and your x-axis. So in going over here, the more you push the throttle down, the pedal comes, basically the power comes down in a straight fashion. That is a linear throttle shape. Now you can tweak this, and what it will do is it will have, it talks about the S shape. I can't obviously highlight that on there, but what that will effectively mean, again, think of your X and your Y, sorry, your Y and your X. So as you put the power down, it's actually going to ramp the gas, the amount of power that gets delivered to the car in this kind of a shape. So it's going to come up a bit higher and then initially over a linear. So what that will do is if perhaps you're a bit hesitant in putting the power down, but you know that the car is nice and stable in this sort of the first 50% of the throttle shape, and you want to get that power down as soon as possible. But then perhaps you start to struggle when the car hits its power band, sort of, about sort of 70% throttle. So what that can do is it can give you a good kick coming out of the corner, but then it just smooths it out so that it doesn't have this horrible habit of wheel spinning, and then it ramps it back up again towards the last part. So as you're sort of in 80-90%, it really kicks it back in again. So what you can do is you can have a tweak with the throttle positioning. That can also help when you get a little bit of wheel spin coming out of some corners or exits of some sort of corners, to actually smooth out the throttle shaping so that the car doesn't break free quite so much. So have a play with that, see how you feel. If you just want it to be nice and linear, in 12 as a setting, you want to leave that on. Boost map setting, you're always going to leave that at 1, unless you obviously need to do a bit of fuel saving. Same with the energy map as well. And then the night LED strips, of course that always has to be set to blue. That's got to be Apex blue. You can't change it any other colour. I mean, I suppose you could go for green, Apex green. Those would be the ones. But anything else, well, you're going to lose 0.2 of a second, so don't change them. So let's talk about some of the chassis settings then. So your ARB stiffness and your ARB blades, that's all to do your anti-roll bars here. So we've got 3 different settings on the anti-roll bar. You've got disconnected, soft and stiff. And fortunately iRacing have actually put it in this kind of an order for us. And so a stiff anti-roll bar will give you understeer. That is effectively what it's doing. Not always though. I will put that a disclaimer in there. A softer one will give you more oversteer or less understeer, however you want to describe it, and so will a disconnected. Basically, the softer the anti-roll bar is, the more mid-corner turn you will get. However, with a stiff anti-roll bar at the front, if the car has a habit of not turning in very well into sort of medium speed and high speed corners, a stiffer anti-roll bar will mean that the car will lean less going into those corners, and it'll actually bite a little bit earlier. So it might be that it's those type of corners that you're struggling with. Then perhaps go a little bit stiffer on the front anti-roll bar. It could be that you could use the blade settings instead. So it might not be that you want to change your actual stiffness. You could just go with like a D3 instead, and that will give you slightly stiffer anti-roll bar, as opposed to the D1 that Antoine's kind of got here. So you can go all the way up to D6, and then you can go to a stiff and back to a D1. That would be just higher than a soft D6 setting. Your front toe in. Typically, you're going to want this fairly close to 0. Toe out is slightly better, so obviously negative here. That will help the car turn in. But if you go too excessive with this, it will cause a lot of heat to build up in the tyres, and that you will notice that over a long run, you'll basically burn out the tyres. So this is why you'll find most sets are fairly neutral, with perhaps just a hair of negative of toe. For qualifying sets, you can go a bit more aggressive because obviously you want to get some heat into the tyres, and you really don't care about burning them out too much over a couple of laps. So you can be a bit more aggressive in qualifying if you want. If of course on the race set you find it is a bit twitchy on turn in, and this setting here obviously is at minus 1.5, you can come down, and that will stabilise the car just a little bit on entry, and give you better tyre wear as well. So something to keep into mind. Your brake pads. This is effectively how quickly the car is going to stop, so how aggressive the stop. As a team, we tend to favour the lower settings, And the reason we do that is because we don't feel that it heats the tyres up quite as much. A high friction will heat the tyres more, especially in the GTEs because there's no ABS. And the hotter they get, the slower you get. That's just the way kind of iRacing is. So we tend to favour the lower settings. But if, for example, you're struggling to get the car stopped in some of these high braking zones, first off, I'd go and check to make sure in the telemetry you're braking at the same point as the coaches. If you're not, obviously back up your braking. But if you are and you still can't get the car stopped, then perhaps you need to come up a little bit on the brake pads. Your spring perch offset, what this will do is this will affect the ride height of the car. So if I just do some adjustments for the moment, we can make the car a little bit lower. Of course, it's Fatal Tech now. So if you make adjustments, say, to the spring rates, which we'll talk about in a moment, you can readjust the ride height of the car. So let's say, for example, I go a little bit stiffer on the car. You see the front end has popped up. We want to get it back down to as low as we can possibly get it on the front end. There we go, can't go any lower than that. And the reason we would, that was all kinds of wrong on the settings. There we go. The reason we will want to get it lower is because it's affecting the aerodynamic balance. Now, a GT car obviously does have a rear wing as well, but it also has rake, and rake has a big impact onto how the car turns in and out of corners. So think of a car obviously that's perfectly flat. That obviously has pretty neutral amounts of rake, so the downforce would just sort of flow over the car. Um, if you have, like you see the Red Bulls on Formula One, the rear end really jacked up and the front end down, that's going to make the car turn much more. So the car will have much better rotation. If you have negative rake, so your front end sticking up in the air and the car is lower on the rear end, well, that will have a habit of wanting to understeer. So you can use this as well in terms of the ride heights. If, say, for example, you feel like the car is turning in too much, you could raise the front of the car up ever so slightly, and that will just take a little touch of turning in due to the aerodynamics. Now, I feel like Aero has a much bigger impact in your medium and high speed corners. If it's a slow speed corner that you're trying to affect, don't really look at the rake. That's not really going to make much difference. But if it is those medium and high speed corners where it's a bit twitchy going in, then perhaps a bit of front end might make a little bit of difference added in the height there. You can, of course, if, say for example, you are that, which I think was as low as we could get, yeah. Let's just say we were as low as we could get, but you were like, well, do you know what? I want a little bit more turning. In this case, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here, and I'm going to go and say, well, let's add a couple of clicks of rear ride height onto the rear of the car. So what we've done is we've actually jacked the rear up a little bit instead of dropping the front down, and that gives us exactly the same as it would have done to drop the front end down. So we get more rake on the car, which means we get a little bit more turning. So just so you can't, because you can't lower the rear front of the car, you can still add aerodynamic turn by adjusting the rear ride height as well. Right, back to the front end and to the spring rates. So spring rates are fairly similar in what they would do to the anti-roll bars. A softer spring will grip into the circuit much more in towards the middle of the corner than, say, the entry or exit. So if you feel that the car is just understeering through the middle of the corner, a softer spring will be a little bit better. Let me just readjust. Of course, every time you adjust the springs, you've got to adjust your ride height, so get it back down. You can see it's a bit of oh well, it'd help if I did it right, wouldn't it? Got to watch to make sure you are the same. I don't suppose it would really matter if they were a little bit different in some corners to another, but we tend to go for symmetrical setups. Always seems to work best in the sim. Yeah, so if again you had understeer mid-corner, then perhaps dropping this down from where we were 200 there to 180, that will give you a little bit more. But again, if it's on entry to perhaps a medium or high-speed corner, then perhaps the car is rolling too much and just not biting into the track. So we just need to stiffen up the suspension ever so slightly just to make that tyre basically dig into the ground. And that's where increasing that will make a bit of a difference. Another place that we might have a slightly stiffer suspension is perhaps somewhere like Le Mans or Monza. And the reason we might want a stiffer suspension is because when the car's going in a straight line, down those Mulsanne straights, the aerodynamic or the air basically pushes the front end of the car down. And the faster you go, the more it gets pushed down, and the more rake you end up having, and the more rake you have, the more drag you have. So that will slow you down in a straight line. So it might be that, like I say, at Le Mans, we might go stiffer because all the time is made up on the straights to some extent. The faster, more top end we can get out of the car, the better the lap time is going to be. So we kind of want to reduce the rake down the straights and having the car nose not dip quite so far will make a difference to that as well. So that might be why we run slightly higher springs in some different tracks. You might look at them and go, that's a bit weird. And that's kind of why. We'll get the turn elsewhere. So let's talk about, well, actually, do you know what? We'll come back to dampers in a moment. Obviously, cambers we spoke about in the previous video, how to kind of set them up and get them in the right point. Caster, the coach is going to get the caster into a pretty good place for you. Um, where you might want to adjust the caster is dependent on how much force feedback you get. And a higher caster will make the steering much, much stiffer. Um, so if the force feedback is just chronic, then perhaps come down a little bit on your caster just to aid you in being able to catch the car when it slides and things like that. We tend to be at a higher caster rate at the moment. That might change, and of course the coaches will tweak the setups based on that. But yeah, if you find that the steering wheel's just too heavy, then drop this caster level down, and that will give you will just make the steering a little bit lighter and a little bit more controllable. If you find the steering is just numb, there's nothing there and it's too light, and then in that case, that's when you need to go up on the caster. Rather than changing your force feedback settings, of course, your force feedback should be what it is, based on sort of the Newton meters in the car and stuff like that. But that's something for another video. The obviously we touched on the spring perch offset, what raising the rear would do in terms of it would give you more turn in because of rake. The spring rates on the rear, that is pretty much the same on the front. However, they kind of have the opposite effect. So a softer spring here will give you more grip coming out of corners, so acceleration zones. But it'll also make the car understeer through sort of medium speed, high speed corners or exits of corners. And that's because you've actually got more grip. So the rear of the car is a bit more planted, might overpower the front. So if we're understeering off corners, we're not rotating around, we could benefit from a slightly stiffer spring rate here as well. Um, but again, typically we find ourselves at the lower end of the spectrum with most setups at the moment on iRacing. So just have a little tweak, see which one feels better for you. Go down, go up. It may be that your personal driving style maybe just wants a tiny little bit more rotation off the corner, or perhaps it wants to be a bit more stable. It wants a little bit less. So do have a little play. Camber on the rear, again, we covered on the last video. You're towing on the rear of the car. Again, this is very similar to the front. We're going to want it somewhere in in and around the zero area. The closer to zero you get, or even into the negatives, for example, the car will have a habit of turning in more freely into corners. So this is why we're going to head towards zero. Once we get beyond zero, it can be a little bit quirky in how the car does rotate in. So we tend to always favour a setup that's very, very close to zero, but still in the positives. Um, the closer we come down to zero as well, the faster the car will actually go in a straight line. More positive toe in actually slows the car down. So again, that's another reason why we're going to do that. It's free lap time for us, and we can balance the car elsewhere in the setup to make it turn in. But if you're finding still you've done some tweaks based on what I've said, and you still the rear end still feels a bit funny coming into corners, then perhaps just go up a little bit on the rear toe in, and that will just stabilize that car on turn in. You know, a click or two might be all you need, and it'll make make a bit of difference. The anti-roll bar on the rear again works just the same as the front. You've got your different stiffness levels, and the same as the spring rate. A disconnected spring is the softest you can get. A stiff one, of course, is the stiffest. Um, the softer the anti-roll bar, the more grip you get, the more traction you'll get out of acceleration zones, the more understeer you'll get coming off of the corner. Again, like the springs at the moment, we tend to favour somewhat softer ARB settings at the moment. Um, if you want just a tiny little bit of extra rotation off the corner, if you find it's pushing coming off, then maybe just adjust the blades a couple of clicks or something like that will make a bit of difference. But again, if you want a bit more stability, then perhaps drop down the ARB blades here to say as soft as you can get. Wing angles, so just double checking, just to make sure I wasn't going to tell you the thing right. So obviously a 0 gives you the least amount of downforce on the rear of the car. 5 gives you the most amount of downforce. So this has two effects. As you drop this down, this will mean that the car will turn into those medium and high speed corners a little bit easier, and give you a little bit more rotation sort of through the middle of the corner as well. But obviously it does affect downforce, so it might be that you were using the overall downforce to hold on to a corner, so you didn't sort of understeer off the circuit. And now that you've taken overall downforce off, you might not just have enough grip to be able to hold on. I'm thinking of like Puan as an example. Again, one of those super high speed corners, and you just don't want to understeer off from the exit. It might actually be, even though you're thinking, oh, I'll give myself more turn, you've lost the overall downforce and lost overall grip. So you kind of have to balance that out. Now, the other thing it will do is affect how much drag you have. So expect to see this wing angle reduced at places like Le Mans as well for the straight line speed. Some cars are a bit quirky in terms of how their aerodynamics are turned up, and it might be that, and you'll have to test this by looking at the data, a 3 setting might be the optimal setting in terms of the drag ratios and things like that. So do have a play at some circuits, those high speed ones, and make sure that you can't gain an extra half a kilometre an hour down the straights by having like maybe a 3 or a 2 on the wing, just because of how the rake sits on the car. It might be a little bit more aerodynamically efficient. Yeah, there are some little quirks that come out in the iRacing physics, so do keep an eye on them. Right, let's talk about dampers then. So you've got low speed, so LS stands for low speed dampers, and you've got high speed dampers. So low speed dampers affect the car, how they transition in and out of a corner. High speed dampers, they affect how the car rides over bumps. So if you've got issues going over bumps, don't go off changing your low speed dampers. It just won't make a difference. It's all about the high speed. Now, what we are trying to do with the high-speed dampers, so when we're talking about the front, so the compression, what's happening here is we will think of we're going along the circuit, and let's think of a big sausage curb here. So we're going along, and then we ride over this sausage curb. As we hit that, our front wheel effectively travels up towards the chassis, and that is our high-speed compression. So basically, the wheel is coming into the shock and it's compressing the damper. So the more compression we have, so the higher the compression setting. So as we go up here, now that is basically going to try and stop that front wheel from smashing in to its, into like the bump stop or the highest um, compressed state it can possibly get. Um, so some bumps will be fairly low and tame, so you won't need to have much compression damping on there. But some, like I say, a sausage curb will be mega, and we will need a lot of damping to try and smooth that out to some extent. Of course, if you have too much damping, what happens is that actually the tire itself, instead of riding the bump, you'll just hit it and it'll be like a jump, because it won't compress at all, and the car will just go flying through the air. So what the objective we're trying to do with the high-speed dampers is we want the wheel or the tire to follow the bump, or this again, I'll use a sausage curb, this fake sausage curb thing that I'm putting here. So as we're driving on, we want that tire to basically follow the bump all the way up and all the way down. So when we're coming up, we're talking about the compression, but when we're coming back down again across it, that's the rebound. So if we've got too much damping on the rebound, that will prevent that tyre from falling back to the ground, and that's again when we're in the air. So if we've got lots of damping, that's going to do that. If we have very little damping, it will want to basically come down at a very aggressive rate. Now what might happen if it does that is you might end up with a bit of pogo where the car bounces because the tyres come down too fast, the car's not settled, and it's going to bounce back up again, so that you get that sort of that pogo bouncing kind of effect. So you have to kind of balance that. Now, I have to say, high-speed damping, you really need to know what you're looking at in the telemetry software. There are damper histograms that you can look at, that will give you an idea of kind of what's going on with the car. And of course, every bump and every curb is different. You will never get a damping setup that is perfect for every single bump. Um, so if you want to know a little bit more, do a bit of research on damper histograms, and that will explain how you can find the best average damper setting for the circuit that you're at. Now, of course, it might be that you have a troublesome area, like one area of the circuit, and in that case, you can just fine-tune your damping. Front and back, high speed damping on the rear is exactly the same as the front, so the compression as the wheel comes in, rebound on the way down. You can have a fiddle and see how the car reacts differently over that one particular bump when you are changing your settings. Now, what I would suggest you do is that you change your compression um, first, or on the car in general, front and rear, without changing rebound. So you're just focusing on one area first. So it's just compression. Did that make the car any better? Yes or no? If that did, but you still think it's not perfect, perhaps go a little bit further, maybe a couple of clicks up, made it a little bit better. Well, maybe try another click and see if that makes it even better. If you get to a point where you're like, well, it is better, but I can't click any further, I'm already at 11, yeah, then at that point you've perhaps maximized what you can get out of the compression settings here. So maybe you might want to start looking at rebound settings then. So we'll go, well, actually, let's see if coming down on the high-speed rebound is better. And that's how you'll dial into one particular area that might be a real troublesome spot. You might have a really flat track. Obviously, we're at Interlagos, so it's kind of okay. But we do have a couple of bumps that we have to deal with, and that's kind of how you can dial in on that sort of one area of the circuit. Right, I hope that made sense in terms of high-speed dampers. If you've got any questions on that, because it is complicated, do give me a little shout on Discord, and I'll try and help. Maybe even jump on voice comms and talk about it. But let's talk about low-speed compression then. Last thing to talk about today. So low speed, like I said, this affects how the car turns in and out of corners. When the compression is effectively when the front end of the car wants to come towards the ground. So that then compresses the damper. So it's a bit different to high speed. Yeah, so it's more the car itself is being pushed in towards the ground. That is when compression kicks in. And if you are trying to restrict this, so if you have more damping, that will try and keep the front end of the car up in the air. If you have less damping, so a lower number here, that will allow the front end to basically drop towards the ground much easier. Now, when you when the when you have a lower compression setting, what that's going to allow to do is the car to turn in more freely. That gives you more turning. When you're trying to keep the front of the car in the air, that will give you less turning, so more understeer. Now, the reason that does that is twofold. One, because of aerodynamics and rake, so it will affect your rake angle on the car. But the second as well, it just depends on how aggressive it's basically pushing the tire into the ground as well. So how much you're loading up the tire. So yeah, so it's twofold, but generally, without getting into too much detail, a lower setting here will mean the car will turn in more. A higher setting will mean that the car will turn in less. On the low speed rebound, what this is when the front end is basically coming up, so the car, sorry, is coming away from the tires, and the back end squats under acceleration and things like that. So that's when rebound comes in. And if we have lots of damping, so a higher number here, so say we're running 11, this is going to want to try and slow down the rate that this front end will come up and into the air. Now, what that will do is that means that actually we will rotate off the corner more, so we'll have more oversteer off the corner. And the reason that does that again is because one, it's trying to keep the weight on the front end of the car, excuse me, and on tires, but also it keeps the aerodynamics in a position where we have a positive rake for longer, so we have more rotation off aerodynamically. So again, it's twofold, so it's affecting the car that way. Now, if we drop the setting here, so we're at a very low rebound setting, that's just going to allow the car to basically pop the nose straight up in the air. When the nose of the car pops up, we have to think of damping as well, especially low speed damping, more like a seesaw on a car. If the front end of the car is popping up in the air, 9 times out of 10 the rear end is being pushed down. We obviously have a center point of gravity, and it comes up here, it's going to go down here. If it comes up here, it's going to go down here. We'll come on to that in a second when we start talking about the rear end. So yeah, so what will happen with a low speed with a very little damping here is we're going to have reduced rake because that back end's going to be down, front end's going to be up, so we're going to have less oversteer, so we're going to have understeer coming off the corner. And that's a way that you can dial. So if the car feels like it's rotating a little bit too much, then perhaps drop your low speed damping, and that will just tighten up the car a little bit more on the exit for you. Now, the low speed on the rear of the car actually has the opposite effect to the front of the car, and that's because we were talking about this seesaw effect. What happens to one happens to the other. So the low speed compression, that's when obviously the rear of the car is coming down. And in that particular case, if we try to prevent that from happening, so we're trying to keep the rear end of the car up, we are going to have a higher compression ratio here. And so what that is going to do, that's going to try and keep that rear end in the air, which means we're going to try and keep a bit of rake on the car. So coming off of a corner, because this is where the rear end's going to be the compression's going to come in, it's when we're accelerating. And it's going to squat down. It's got nothing to do with braking, because when we're braking, what happens when we brake? The front end goes down, the rear end comes up. So compression has nothing to do with how the car handles coming off the corner. coming into the corner, sorry, it's all about coming off the corner. So a higher setting here, like I say, that will try and keep that rear end up in the air, which means it will rotate more off the corner. So if you find that again you've got a bit of oversteer, then you need to come down this setting. But if you've got a bit of oversteer, then perhaps coming, um, sorry, that was wrong, let me correct that. If you have oversteer coming off the corner, you want to come down, but if you have understeer coming off the corner, then you want to go up on this to make it rotate a little bit more. Now the last thing to cover is the low speed rebound damping. So where this will have an effect, that's on the entry of a corner. And the reason that is because we brake, come down the straights, we brake, the front end comes down, the rear end pokes up. Now if we have hardly any damping, what that's going to do is that's going to allow that rear end to poke up in the air really fast. And when that happens, we obviously gain in rake. And once again, the rake will help the car turn because of the aerodynamic balance of the car. But also we're loading up the front end of the car. So we've got less load on the rear of the car, which means that the front end has more grip than the rear, so the car will rotate. So it's twofold. It's done based on how we're loading up the tyres and the aerodynamics. But, of course, if we put a lot of damping onto the rebound here, that's going to try and keep this rear end much lower. So it's going to be much slower to basically come for the car to sort of ping up at the rear. And when we do that, that's going to give us actually a bit of understeer because effectively our rake angle is going to be much more reduced. We're not loading up the front tyre anywhere near as much as the rear tyre, so the car won't turn in quite as well. And that's another way that you can balance out the car on the entry and exit of the corner. So there's 4 different damper settings there that can have a massive impact on how the car rotates in and out of the corner. So, right, there was a lot to take in there. I hope I've covered everything. Please ask me any questions that you may have on Discord. I know there's going to be a lot. There is so much with these GTE cars. The next video we're going to be talking about the drivetrain. That's a fairly simple one, to be fair, in comparison. But for now, thanks very much for watching. Thanks very much for joining the Academy, and of course I'll catch you again in another one.